Last night I was in the live stream with Patrick from Surviving by America and his friends, and somebody brought up this leftoid podcast called The Farm, and I've never heard of it, but they said it's the source of that meme where someone's saying, we have the documents, we've got the documents. And I thought that was Alex Jones, and I guess I wasn't too far off, because they said it was sort of a leftoid version of Alex Jones, and to me, from reading the list of it, it looked like it was also quite similar to the Tim Kelly show. Tim and Joe over there at Powers and Principalities, and his other one that he does with his guests, Interesting Times. And so Patrick said that I should look at it and see what I thought. And it particularly related to this, how can you say it, this leftoid delusion that the United States government, Western governments in general, are populated by secret fascists, or secret Nazis, as they might call them, and that you can often see inside the CIA or various Western security and intelligence services the activities of secret Nazis, secret fascists. How do they come up with this absolutely insane viewpoint? Where do they get this idea? You know, we would be overjoyed if there were any secret fascists or secret national socialists in Western governments, but it's vanishingly few. Instead, it seems like they're populated generally by open liberals and secret communists. So it's about the furthest that you could get from secret fascists. Now, the way that the leftoids come up with this delusion, this is sight unseen, right? Like, I haven't looked at The Farm, but I sort of know about this general trend. It goes all the way back to the mid-1920s. When let's back up first. In the 20th century and the late 19th century, there were battles between four major groups of ideologies, four major groups of political movements. The first and the oldest is the traditional form, which is throne and altar. This is authoritarianism. It doesn't matter if it's a military dictator. It doesn't matter if it's an autocratic, if it's a democratic autocrat like Vladimir Putin. It doesn't matter if it is, it's just any sort of single leader who appeals to traditionalism, to social conservatism, and nationalism. So that's the oldest thing. Doesn't matter if it's a king or an emperor or whatever it happens to be. If he's an effective authoritarian, he will generally support the church, traditional lifestyles, families, all that sort of thing. That's sort of the basic standby for human society. And then in the modern world, you get revolutionary liberalism all the way into the neoliberalism of today. That's the second form. Now, domination by those liberal capitalists creates enormous social dissent. It creates a proletariat, and it creates a revolutionary vanguard of the far left. That's Marxism. Okay, so we go from authoritarianism to liberalism to Marxism. Once we get to Marxism, we then have a reaction to Marxism, either from within, that renews itself and purges itself of most of the bad elements, and that's how we get fascism, or we get an anti-communist neo-authoritarianism, and that's, National Socialism. And of course, none of National Socialism can't exist without fascism, and then they inform each other once they come around. So anyhow, we don't need to get into all that, but those are the four main ideologies or groups of political movements of the 19th and 20th century. It's authoritarianism or monarchism, liberalism, Marxism, and then fascism or National Socialism. So since the Marxists are third in line, and since after the Marxists become the dominant strain of the far left, displacing the socialists, their interpretation ends up becoming the standard worldwide on many issues, including how to interpret fascism and National Socialism. So the Marxists take over their first state in Russia in 1917 and 1918, and then in 1922 the fascists more or less defeat communism in Italy, where it had been extremely powerful, and where it looked, it was just as likely in Italy or Germany that one of those would become the next Soviet state and the first Soviet state in Western Europe. So this was quite disheartening to Marxists, and so they had to come up with theories about why did Marxism fail in Italy? How did it fail? What was the root cause of this? And A. James Gregor writes a lot about it in Mussolini's Intellectuals and his other books. But basically, the short version is that the Marxists in the Soviet Union and elsewhere came up with the theory that fascism was just the attack dog of capitalism, that these liberal capitalists were threatened by Marxism, and they were going to generate this violent reactionary movement in order to keep the Marxists from getting into power. And so in this viewpoint, which comes out of the Marxism of the 1920s, the mid to late 20s, fascism and capitalism are linked like this, and fascism is the attack dog of capitalism, and fascism is a reactionary force. And basically everything about that's wrong. Everything about it's wrong. It's just nonsense. But since this was injected into the worldwide, this toxin was injected into the water supply of intellectual leftist thought was contaminated by this bacteria. It's really never left. And so these micro-brained, brainlet leftists are recycling crap theories from the 1920s and 30s about what fascism is. Now, when they see liberalism behaving in a totalitarian manner, which is totally natural and normal to liberalism, paradoxically, at least neoliberalism, when they see liberalism behaving in a totalitarian manner, they call it fascism. Okay, that's mainly just because of war propaganda from the World War II era, from before, during, and after World War II. So when they see totalitarian liberalism cracking down, let's say, on some part of the left in some Western country, they say those are fascist tendencies, even though fascism has no monopoly on totalitarianism. And at least today, liberalism and Marxism have much more of a track record for totalitarianism than fascism or National Socialism do, contrary to the myths and legends that are, propagated on a daily basis across the world. So this is how I understand it. When these Bernie Sanders social democracy, type people, these Socialist Party type people see the giant liberal Leviathan, the neoliberal behemoth of banks, private mega corporations, and aspects of completely toothless so-called democratic representative government. When they see them working together and attacking any part of the left anywhere in the world, they say, oh my God, it's fascist. And then they fall back on the Soviet example, or the Soviet interpretation of fascism being the lapdog of capitalism. That's the way I see it. So I think, we really need to talk about Project Gladio. I'm going to go do some stuff, and then maybe I'll come back here and record a little bit about Gladio to go with this, because it is very important to discuss that example of how the truth and the later interpretation of historical events get so twisted in the public consciousness, or at least among the small groups of people, very, very small numbers of people who actually take the time to read or find out anything about history. So even amongst that vanishingly small minority, the interpretations are still completely wrong. Okay, I'll be back. In a strange way, Project Gladio doesn't really have much to do with fascism or National Socialism itself. It's really prototypical Cold War behavior to which those ideologies of fascism and National Socialism get reduced to furniture in the covert and political destabilization game that was going on between the Eastern Bloc and the Western Bloc. So at the end of World War II, the Germans and their side, the Axis, were they were obviously going to lose the war. I think from 1943 onward, pretty much everybody understood that. And so the Germans were fighting to the death because they understood that they were going to be raped and genocided and looted by the Western Allies and the Soviet Union. They understood this. It was made perfectly clear to everybody. The Western political leaders, journalists, academia, everybody said, not only are we going to defeat Germany, but we're going to defeat National Socialism and quote-unquote Prussianism, which is very important because Prussia is an ancient part of the German geographic idea and also German culture. There's not really a Germany without Prussia, and so modern Germany, I don't even know if you could call it Germany anymore. And the Allied Control Commission after World War II, maybe in 48 or 52, sometime in the years after World War II, they literally abolished Prussia, saying that it had been basically a net evil for world history, so they abolished it. That is the only time in world history, or at least modern world history, in which I can think of states declaring another state evil after it's been defeated and wiping it off the map and saying we're not going to have this anymore. And so today they have Berlin, they have Brandenburg, they have other areas, but I don't know if there's anything called Prussia today. And of course the territory itself was largely cleansed of ethnic and racial Germans, and through both murder and deportations, genocide, state-sponsored Western and Soviet genocide, and doesn't exist anymore. So the Germans knew what was in store for them, and they were right, because it happened through the Morgenthau Plan and the Houghton Plan and what all those various things are. So the Germans were fighting to the end. Now, these other countries on the German side, like Romania, Hungary, and Italy, for instance, and Japan also was sort of in between these two categories. Japan was sort of in between what was planned for Germany and then these other states. So Finland, Romania, Hungary, Italy, they actually could make peace with their enemies by unilaterally surrendering. And maybe they would have different government installed, maybe they would have some depopulation, some territory would be lopped off, but they wouldn't be genocided. And so this was an attractive idea for a lot of these political leaders in these countries. They thought this would be a good thing to do. And so in Bulgaria, Hungary, Romania, and Italy, in all these places, the political leadership decided to drop out of the war. Now, in multiple of those countries, the Germans responded with either an attack or a coup on those countries to force them to continue to fight. And so I'm pretty sure that happened in Hungary. It famously happened in Italy, in which Mussolini had been arrested basically and put in detention, and the Germans rescued him and established him a new government in northern Italy that was sort of a second attempt at fascism, you know, for lack of a better term, free of the encumbrances of the king and the military caste, the high-ranking military guys, free of all that stuff. So what this means is that the Germans had to administer large parts of territory that up until these points in the war, when they had to do these coups or attacks and take over these other countries like Hungary and Italy, the Germans had to administer them now through military discipline. And this also meant that the Germans had to be the ones fighting communist undergrounds. They had to fight sabotage. They had to fight the OSS, whoever all these various enemies were that were operating in these different countries. And so, in the last 2 or 3 years of the war, let's say, so 43, 44, and 45, the Germans had intelligence and counter-espionage and counter-sabotage people all over Europe, in all the areas that they controlled. And so particularly in Italy, let's say, that's the main example, because that's where Project Gladio is best known, I think, or the events around Project Gladio are best known. So in 1945, the Western Allies defeat all of the Axis countries. It's all over. It's finished. And let's say that you're one of these German counter-sabotage, counter-intelligence guys, and you've got your clique of local people. You know, you've got 10 or 20 of these pro-German Italians. You've got 2 or 3 Germans. And you don't really want to go home to Germany because it's actually even worse there than it is in Italy. So maybe you hang around. Now, what the Allies do is they find you and they either line you up against a wall and shoot you, or they say, you know a lot about what's going on here, you've got a lot of files, and we're about to institute a new pro-British or pro-American government, and we certainly don't want the Soviets to take over Italy, so you're going to work for us now. And so this sort of thing happened. Oh, and then if you don't agree, you're going to go to Nuremberg or one of those places, and not only are you going to be tortured and have your testicles crushed or chopped off, and not only are you going to be beaten and mistreated by Jews for months on end, but you know your family's going to starve to death if they're even still alive. So these guys were put in a horrible situation. Some of them were just killed outright, either by Allied soldiers, by communist partisans, by communist quote-unquote resistance. So a lot of them chose to work for the Allies. A lot of them didn't. Some were killed, some chose to work, some didn't work for them. And there was all sorts of double dealing and shady behavior that went on. Now, I'm not going to talk too much about the details of Project Gladio. For that, there's really good books that you can go read, and there's an excellent documentary that was made by the BBC that you can watch on YouTube that I think was aired one time and then shelved, or it was never aired at all. It's one of those things where people make a really good, interesting documentary. The top brass isn't really aware of what's going on, and it gets shelved before the public ever really gets to see it, and then they never talk about it again. This has happened with multiple things, like maybe the Franklin scandal or the Finders case, Project Gladio. Those are 2 or 3 of the cases I can think of where something like this happened. So, the story about this, the way it's told, is that the Germans were really evil and they had set up terrorist cells across Europe so that after Germany lost the war, these terrorist cells could continue to kill Allied soldiers, bomb things, and generally make Europe an ugly place to live for as long as they could, because they were fanatical fascists and fanatical National Socialists. What I told you about how this stuff got started, that's how I think it really started, and that makes a lot more sense to me than this story that I just mentioned, where the Germans had set these people up as evil terrorists, basically. I don't think anybody really had the stomach for that after the war. It really took the Soviet Union and communists, and then the United States and Britain and liberals to keep the conflict going. Most of the people who lived on continental Western and Central Europe itself were absolutely exhausted by this bloodshed, and they were ready for this stuff to be over. And if they hadn't been driven to do more of it, then they probably wouldn't have, I don't think. So the way that this worked in practice was these former fascists and National Socialists were working all for the West. That's what Project Gladio is. and it was in probably 5 or 6 countries at least, I think. I know they had some in Belgium and Italy for sure. I think Belgium, Netherlands, and Italy, I think those were the main ones, but other countries as well. And the West, the CIA basically, and MI5 or MI6, whichever one, were using these guys to attack and kill their enemies and undermine communist subversion. But they're doing, Western liberal subversion, so it's not like they're really doing good work. It's two evil powers fighting against each other, and they're using some men who were on the right side during World War II to do the wrong thing after the war. And in that connection, I can also mention there was I don't know if it's still up, but there was a very interesting interview, like an hour or 2 hours long, of a Stuka dive bomber, a very famous Stuka dive bomber from World War II. And he talked about all the missions he went on and the guys he knew in the war and his war experience. And then at the end, he's demobilized, and one of his former flying compatriots comes to him and says, hey, I just got a job. I'm working for the West German government. We're going to build a new West German Air Force, and we would really like for you to participate because we've got to fight against these communists. We've got to keep these communists at bay, and we've got to defend Germany. And this famous Stuka dive bomber, was just chuckling and, sadly chuckling and telling his friend, like, working for the Americans and the British is no better. It's no better than working for the Soviet Union during the Cold War. You can't really say that Roosevelt and the Americans did any less to kill Germans during World War II than the Soviets did. And so you had some people who did what the other guy did, and they went to work for the West Germans and they built them up, and then you had other people like Raymer, Yaki, whatever, who were perfectly happy to look to the other side and say, we see our geopolitical future in the East rather than the West. And so this little dialectic is basically what Project Gladio is all about. Now, the significance of it, I think for us, is you can use, and I've said this before, you can use this to show people how little regard the Western governments have for the lives of their citizens. They are perfectly willing to do false flag, terrorist attacks, employing people that they say are evil and should all be killed and hung in war crimes and blah, 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 whatever. They're perfectly willing to use these people to perform false flag, domestic terrorist attacks, not even for some sort of apocalyptic, eschatological victory that's going to save everyone, but just for some sort of crass and filthy little political issue of the day, such as winning one election cycle. So what we're going to do in this case, historically, what they would say is, we're going to do this bombing and we're going to blame it on the communists, because if we do this bombing a week before the election, then their vote totals are going to be 3% lower, and that means we'll get a coalition that's this type of coalition with these market liberals rather than this other coalition with social democrats. So that's basically what was going on as far as I understand. That is the ultimate significance of Project Gladio. And of course, like I was saying in the first half of this, the leftoids, the brainlet leftoids, will look at this and they'll say, oh look, see, we've got evidence that the capitalists in the West were using Nazis to undermine social democracy, when it's obvious that these same so-called capitalists were funding the Soviet Union, were completely saving them from being destroyed by fascism during the Second World War, and have never, really had done anything that would lead you to believe that they're fascist or National Socialist or sympathetic with those ideas. So maybe now that I've described my thoughts on this stuff, maybe now I'll go check out the farm and see how close my preconception is to what these guys actually say. All right, thank you for your time. I'm going to say a few more things about Gladio, and talk about a couple of people who, while not directly affiliated with it, not directly on one of these Gladio teams, they give you a really good idea of how a project like that could come into existence and who's behind it. The first one is James Jesus Angleton. According to his official biographies and mainstream sources, he's half Anglo and half Hispanic, and he's one of these guys who got into the OSS after it had been started by a Wall Street financier to function as the sort of private intelligence agency of the Roosevelt clique while they were in office, and worked his way up through the organization after it became the CIA, eventually becoming either the head of the entire thing or the head of its operations and counter-espionage divisions. And so his importance in the history of the CIA and the American intelligence community can't be overstated, because he came in on the ground floor as a very young man and was there through all of its twists and turns. He was an enormous Zionist, okay? Big time fucking Zionist. And not only that, but, in one of these curious twists of history, James Jesus Angleton was trained in British espionage and intelligence techniques by none other than Kim Philby, who was the alcoholic, communist, double agent, married to a Jewish woman, who was the deepest mole, I guess you could say, of Marxist espionage in Britain and therefore the West. And so, as you may or may not know, Kim Philby and 3 or 4 other guys were running this, homosexual, alcoholic, philo-Semitic intelligence network in Britain for the Soviet Union, and got, Lord knows how many people killed for the Soviet Union on behalf of that government during the war and after the war. And like all good Marxists and communists, like Alger Hiss, he always denied his involvement with any of those activities, until finally one day, unlike Alger Hiss, he was basically caught and flew to the Soviet Union and, spent the rest of his life there. So that's the guy who trained James Jesus Angleton, and it was Angleton and his co-workers who created and ran the Gladio project in the 40s, 50s, 60s, and onward. Now, the thing about Gladio is that it touches so many different aspects of politics and culture that you could use it as a jumping off point and talk about whatever you want. And if you listen to the Tim Kelly show, and I'm guessing the Farm too, you can do that, and you can sort of play this. There was a guy who wrote a book about Freemasonry, and he used this term, the plot theory of history, which is to say that he was criticizing people who think that history is a plot like in a book, and that he didn't think history was that way, and he thought that history was rather sort of an unintended series of events that happen to related people and for related reasons, but there's not really like a single mystery or a single plot behind history. He criticized that. And it's basically the anti-conspiracy theory idea, the anti-conspiracy theory interpretation. And I reject that. I think that's totally wrong to take that viewpoint, and that conspiracies are everywhere and they're very important. That being said, I kind of get what he's saying or where he's coming from, and I do think that we should ease the conspiracy theory tendencies and not let them completely determine everything. And so if we do, we end up with this sort of blob theory, B-L-O-B, this blob theory of history, in which you have all these puzzle pieces of all of these historical events and historical persons laid out in front of you, and what you end up doing is just trying to force them all to fit with each other, and you spend all your time looking for connections between them. And this is sort of what Anthony Sutton does in his political works. His best books are the ones that he wrote on the technological transfers, his early books, and then some of the stuff about Skull and Bones, because he's dealing with a lot of factual matters. As far as a theory, I don't think he really has it, and a lot of conspiracy theory people don't have it. And if you don't have a theory, you don't have hypotheses, and you don't have any falsifiable premises, right? So what you end up doing is just collating all this material, seeing how it's related, and then vaguely sort of suggesting that there's an overarching evil conspiracy, and you can't really figure out the aspects of it, its characteristics, or what defines it and separates it. So who are the good guys and who are the bad guys? You don't have any way to tell, because you just sort of have a mound of information, and you do network analysis, and you look at all the connections between these different nodes, and then you can't really synthesize a view of history. You can't end up with a political ideology. You don't have a view of ethics or morality. So you end up sort of just being like a libertarian or an anarchist or a minarchist, and then you just vegetate there politically. I think all that's wrong. I think we do need to have a firm belief system, firm ideology, and a culture that we can offer that's positive in response to all these things that we don't like. And so you have to make firm positive claims about what you think is good and bad. And this blob theory of history and super conspiratorial analysis just doesn't allow you to do it, in my opinion. So you can use Gladio to really get into all that kind of stuff, and it's good to do it a couple times or listen to people do it, just so that you can convince yourself of how related all these people are to each other. Angleton's really good for that. Now, the other one is Gloria Steinem. She's sort of the cultural companion to Gladio. What Gladio was doing was blowing people up, assassinating people, basically doing domestic terrorism and international terrorism in these countries for political purposes. Gloria Steinem was doing cultural terrorism by promoting pornography and feminism while she was basically an employee of the CIA. And she got called out for this basically by what we would now call TERFs, you know, like real feminists who actually believe their stupid ideology but really truly believe it from the heart. They found out that Gloria Steinem was a Fed, and they outed her. They might have been called Red Stockings or something. I can't remember the name. But she got outed for basically being a Fed, taking Fed money. And when she was confronted by leftists, right? The leftists were criticizing her for this. When she got confronted, she held a little press conference, and she said, you know, actually, contrary to what you people are saying, I found that the people at the FBI and the CIA or whatever are all terribly progressive and actually quite open-minded. And so this was her defense. She was having to defend herself from leftists, and so her claim was that the people who were running the FBI and the CIA were actually quite open-minded, progressive leftists themselves, which of course they were. They were liberals and liberal, you know, totalitarianists who didn't have any time for a Marxist in the far left. So none of that's surprising. But my point is merely to say that these people have the same thing going on in different aspects of culture. They were and successfully did undermine the family and the role of women with Gloria Steinem, and then they were carrying on all these political terrorist acts with Gladio. So it's all part of a bigger project. Now, I didn't really talk much about the end of Gladio. It was in the late 1980s, I think, but I haven't looked at the timeline, so I'm not exactly sure. But some of this stuff started coming out. Basically, people started outing aspects of Gladio in Italy, and then it became clear that it had also been going on in Belgium, and I think Switzerland, maybe France and Germany, but I think less so. No doubt a lot of those Red Army faction people and a lot of those murders and abductions that were going on in Germany in the 1960s and 70s, no doubt a lot of that was either being done by the CIA or the Soviet Union in a similar way to Gladio, sort of analogous. But a lot of this stuff started coming out, And it was so tightly linked to the established power structures in the Western world that there was a scandal with the Vatican Bank and also with the P2 Masonic Lodge system in Italy. So Gladio, the Vatican, and then the most powerful Italian Freemasonic group were all found to be basically in bed with each other. In response to this being aired out, some people were killed and some people's political careers were ruined, and then it was basically, you know, swept under the rug and forgotten about and not really publicized much. And so it's all out there, it's in the public record, but you can't really interest anybody in it. It's sort of old news by this point. But the legs on it are deep, and just how deep it goes, I don't know, and I'm not, you know, maybe some people know, but it's really hard to say. The darkest and most freakish aspect of it that I found, I haven't heard anyone talk about this publicly, but I did read about it, and it's called the Dutrow affair in Belgium. Basically, there was a guy who was abducting young women, you know, between the ages of, like, I don't know, 14 and 18. He was abducting them, keeping them in rape rooms, raping them, pimping them out, and then killing them. And so he had done this, and he had actually been caught and then more or less let go, you know, like caught red-handed by the police or the gendarmerie or whatever they're called in Belgium. And then he was let go, and then he did it again and got caught again. And digging into this case, there were alleged links to all of the important political people in Belgian politics. And then there was a woman who, or no, I shouldn't say all the people, but all of the important groups had links to these different people who were involved, and they were, you know, at the highest levels of Belgian politics. Judges, members of parliament, all this sort of thing. Police chiefs, investigators, all that. And so, hold on, let me pause this and get my train of thought back. And so there was a woman who came forward after this stuff came out who she said that she had been a child sex slave who had been pimped out by her grandmother or aunt, something, mother, grandmother, aunt, something like that. And she gave loads and loads of information and personal testimony about the sexual slavery, prostitution, rape, and just every type of abuse and murder you can imagine that was perpetrated against herself and other children. And then she linked her experiences to particular people. She named names, she showed places where this stuff had happened, and there was some sort of basic credibility to her story, and it was a gigantic scandal. Now, if you go read about this, there's a blog where someone wrote up, you know, an enormous amount of information on this Dutrow case, which, you know, you're not going to encounter this stuff anywhere. Basically, you have to go looking for it yourself. The person who was blogging about this, I think, was one of these leftoids, and so they're constantly referring to these international globalist, you know, child raping, murdering scum as being fascists. Okay? Now, if you know anything about Belgium, you know that General Leon de Grelle, God rest his soul, was essentially, we could say, the leader of Belgian fascism. Now, what did he do with his life and career? He tried to save his country, and particularly the Belgian working class, from the corrupt system of division of spoils, basically, by the center left and the center right and the market liberals who were controlling Belgium. After they and the Catholic Church conspired to prevent him from doing that, he then became part of the greatest crusade against evil of the last 300 years. and he recruited a bunch of brave men who, for the most part, died in that crusade. And so there weren't really any so-called Belgian fascists left, right, after World War II, because most of them were killed on the Eastern Front or shot as fascists and collaborators by the liberals and the conservatives and the Marxists after the war was over, or they were living in exile like Dutrow was. And so there was no fascist movement left. It was over. Presumably some few people here and there might have been doing something, but there wasn't really much to speak of. Now, and it was a great tragedy of that era for countries like that, you know, weren't even Germany, but people with good hearts from France or Belgium or Britain who tried to do the right thing. But anyhow, so these leftoids who write these blogs will make these statements about, you know, fascism and attach that to these child predators, these international child prostitution syndicates that are involved with liberal and center-right politics in all these Western countries. And you really just want to reach through the computer screen and grab them and shake them and say, you know, you don't understand what you're talking about. Because for them it's really just a sort of slur, and you know, they bought into that whole idea of like, for some, I guess it's the authoritarian personality. It's the idea that if you want to have a strong system of authority, and if you want to provide, you know, for instance, a good family life by disciplining a child, then you must be a repressed sexual pervert. And so when they see these people behaving in a totalitarian manner or being sexual perverts, they just, you know, call them fascists or Nazis or whatever it happens to be. So I think this about wraps up what I can say about Gladio, is that it was occurring in multiple countries. It is part of an international political ideology called liberalism or neoliberalism. There's only one liberalism. There aren't multiple liberalisms. There's only one, and it's global. There's not multiple Marxisms or communisms. There was in the 20th century. Only one Marxism, only one communism, and it was highly centralized. Liberalism's the same way. It comes out of the Anglo, American, Atlanticist, you know, cancer upon the world. And all of these activities in these different countries, these domestic terrorist activities that were being carried on, you know, they all stem from the same place. And so I think that's about it. This has been pretty disjointed, especially this third part that I'm recording here. But you know, when you're speaking extemporaneously and you don't have a script and you just want to talk about some ideas, then sorry, that's just how we end up. That's what it ends up like. Okay, thank you guys.